This is a very impressive crowd for a snowy digging out day in Washington. I'm pleased to be here with Courtney Beale.
Thank you. Pleasure
Who's
to be here with you.
Senior Director for Global Engagement at the National Security Council. I thought it might be fun just to start off and talk a little bit about you and how you got to be doing the job you're doing. If I understand it right, it's somewhat unusual that you're in the position as somebody who just came up through the ranks of the Foreign Service, essentially. Is that right?
Sure. Well, before I jump into that, I want to take a quick second and just say thank you to you and to Global Ties for having me here today. As I'll explain a little bit about, I've been a Foreign Service officer working around the world in public affairs, 8 offices and embassies around the world, and so I've had the chance to see the IVLP program from somebody working in the field, building relationships, designing programs, looking at how it meets our bilateral goals, and now have an opportunity in this job to see how the incredible network that you all have created with IVLP programs around the world contributes to our national security goals. So thank you so much for being here today and for this great opportunity to talk with all of you. As Neil was saying, I came into this job through the State Department. I joined the State Department when I graduated from college. I took the Foreign Service exam just like anybody and have had the opportunity to work in Latin America and South Asia, primarily doing public diplomacy work, but also doing policy work with our embassies, political reporting, serving as a special assistant and as an advance officer for the Secretary of State. And then had the opportunity to come up and work in the National Security Council to try to help coordinate the interagency. Even though State Department has the lead on most of our public diplomacy work, the other agencies of our government have a huge role to play. And so it's great understanding how the State Department works to be able to now look at how do we bring all the other tools of the US government into complementing our exchange programs and our global engagement around the world.
You became Director of Global Engagement last spring, essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
The office, as I understand it, was more formally created just when Obama came into office in 2009. Tell us just a little bit about the concept of what the office does.
So the office is meant to help coordinate the interagency around public diplomacy and global engagement goals. But it's also meant to give public diplomacy practitioners a seat at the policy table so that it's not policies being created and then turning to your public affairs spokespeople and your cultural and educational officers to say, go implement this. But rather to bring your public diplomacy practitioners to the policy-making table so that they can give input about how people around the world feel about things, who's influential in helping to implement certain policies, and how can we make sure that our public diplomacy tools are being used in support of implementation of all of our national security goals. I think it was Walter Cronkite who once said when he was head of the US Information Agency, don't just bring me in at the crash landing, bring me in at the takeoff too. And so our goal is to be able to be there bringing in the correct public diplomacy officials from the State Department and other agencies at the policy-making table so that they can be part of making national security decisions.
Back in the day, particularly when Condi Rice was Secretary of State, I was diplomatic correspondent. The Journal and wrote about a fair bit about public diplomacy and the efforts that were underway at the State Department then, and that was very much the term. I wasn't familiar really at the time with this idea of global engagement. I don't know if this is just a linguistic kind of moniker or whether there is some substantive difference between global engagement and public diplomacy.
I think global engagement is a little bit broader than public diplomacy. It comes from 2 key tenets of the Obama foreign policy. I think one is a policy of engagement, of whether you're looking at his policies toward Cuba or Burma or Iran, saying that it needs to be a cornerstone of US policy to be engaging and trying to bring people into working with us. But then second of all, looking at trends around the world about how the world is changing and saying that we need an office that's looking at how the US government supports, engages, and influences citizens and non-state actors around the world. So while most of the National Security Council is very focused on what is the US government's relationship with this government, how do we get them to do what we want here, our office is very focused on how do we identify who are the influential populations that can help support a certain policy, and how do we have strategies that are whole of government to engage them?
So I was interesting, before, just in the last 24 hours or so, I spent a fair bit of time looking around kind of at what have people been writing about the state of U.S. public diplomacy and global engagement. And it's kind of fascinating because there was a huge burst of interest in what would this president bring to this arena. And of course, especially after he was elected, he went to Cairo, gave the big speech, and there was that sense of like intense global engagement. And then there's been like a steep falling off of attention being paid to the whole practice in a weird, like it was very hard to find the sort of white papers that various think tanks had done on what's it all amounted to. I don't know if there's a way that you can explain the fact that the concept of public diplomacy seems to have sort of fallen, its profile seems to have fallen a little bit in terms of Washington's attention.
It's a really good question, and I wish that there were more think tanks that were out there writing about what we're doing and how we should be doing it better. Just like any foreign policy practitioner working on a certain relationship with a country, they turn to think tanks and academics to get ideas and outside perspectives. There are several universities that work in this field. The University of Southern California has the Annenberg School, which deals with public diplomacy. There are other universities that look at it from a strategic communications standpoint or a policy standpoint, but it's not as practiced as a field as many other things are. I don't know what exactly accounts for that. Hopefully being able to talk to groups like this and spur more interest in the type of work that we're doing and how we can improve it will help that. I think often at the beginning of an administration, there's a lot more interest in, well, how will things be different now? And now that we're 7 years in, perhaps that's why it's fallen off. But the other area that we look to for ideas is looking at demographic data. So even if we don't have think tanks saying this is what you should do differently, we look at what researchers are finding around the world, whether it's how interconnected we are, how technology and social media are in some ways making the world smaller than ever, but also reducing the power of governments and institutions and increasing the power of hyper-connected young people who know how to leverage those technologies, of entrepreneurs who are leveraging those technologies to solve global challenges, of civil society leaders who have created incredible networks of people advocating for change around the world. So we look at that type of data to figure out how to account for it and integrate it into all of our global engagement strategies.
On the data front, I'm a little bit curious about the kind of measuring success. Again, to go back to the beginning, it's that you look, the big kind of bulk general numbers, the numbers that Gallup gathers around the world, or the numbers that Pew gathers, you see this big spike in sort of the appreciation for America and America's connection with the rest of the world after Obama was elected. And then there's a sort of plateauing of sorts where if there was this sense of like a golden age of American public diplomacy that was the mere fact that he was elected and the way he engaged with the world at the beginning would continue to ramp up, there have been obviously a lot of challenges. Just to ask the metrics question, is there a way that you kind of measure we're succeeding, we're not succeeding that's out there?
Yeah. Well, like any politician will probably say, we don't entirely rely on the polls to tell us whether or not we've been successful. I think that we look at two other big ways to measure success. One is through evaluations. I mean, we do an evaluation of every IVLP program, but we're looking to try to do longer-term impact evaluations that use randomized controlled trials, starting with some of the programs that have come out of the Obama administration, so that we can see how people who participate in these programs, how they either change attitudes about the United States or become more of leaders in their communities as compared to someone who's similar that didn't participate in one of these programs. But then there's also, the anecdotes, and I'm sure you all hear anecdotes from your IVLP participants all the time. And those can't tell the whole story, but can paint a picture of how you're impacting individual lives. And when you multiply that by the approximately 60,000 people a year that in the State Department and ECA is able to impact through exchange programs, the way that we are changing people's lives and supporting foreign policy goals.
I do want to get to the exchange programs in a second. And I just as an FYI, I definitely want to turn to the audience in time because I'm sure that all of you have some great questions to ask of Courtney. In a really basic way, I'm just interested to hear you talk a little bit about the challenges that you face or the various operations of the U.S. government face in trying to do this kind of engagement. In terms of the persona of the United States or the imputed motives of the United States, is that an environment that's improved over the last 7 or 8 years, or sort of remained the same, or become more challenging? Because it would seem to me, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at places like Russia, maybe even to some extent China, I would argue, I would think intuitively that the environment has become more challenging during that time.
I think it really depends on the region. And in some regions, Africa, Southeast Asia, you've seen youth bulges and a lot of people who are really wanting more engagement with the United States. And so there we found that you have a door that's already open and easier to push on. In places like Russia, China, much of the Middle East, yes, it is much more difficult. And so I would say some of the big picture challenges are that you have to recognize when, as the US government, you're not the best messenger, or that you need to be building coalitions such that people are willing to work with you. And it's always easier to go out and just try to do something directly. But when you look at, for example, how do we counter ISIL's propaganda? The US government is not going to be the best messenger for doing something like that, but public diplomacy and the way that you can use exchange programs and cultural programs and trainings and convenings to empower people who have credible voices and positive alternatives, that's a lot harder, but it's really crucial. Another of the big challenges for the US government, I think, is taking on risk. We are not the most risk-friendly of a bureaucracy, but when you're looking at how to keep up when you have Russia and its propaganda machine, or China and the way it curtails our public diplomacy activities, we have to be willing to innovate and try new things. And so sometimes you can do that through partnerships, because partners can take on more risk than the US government. But that's another one of the big challenges that we face.
So innovating and doing new things, what comes to mind in that area? Yesterday when we talked a bit, you mentioned the Lifeline program. Is this an example of innovating and doing new things? Or I guess even for that matter, example of the US not having to lead overtly under the US flag, but under a kind of a group flag of sorts?
Yeah, that's a really good example of both, of how we've responded to both of those. So one of the things our office looks at is, since civil society has a really important voice in the world, how do we empower and support them? And what we found is that civil society is going through a global crackdown, that governments have recognized that civil society does have a greater voice and that it oftentimes holds governments to account. Authoritarian governments and even nominally democratic governments are putting an increasing number of restrictions, financial reporting mechanisms, laws on civil society. And so the president started the Stand with Civil Society initiative to try to help push back against those restrictions and create programs to support civil society. But what we also quickly determined is that not all civil society around the world wants to be directly engaging with the United States, either because they don't agree with our policies or because they're worried about being seen as a foreign agent or somebody implementing a Western agenda. So one example of a program that we've created, which is very much a coalition and a multi-stakeholder program, is called Lifeline. And it brings in 17 governments, Freedom House, and other private sector and NGO partners, and creates grants and financial assistance for human rights defenders, for civil society leaders who are under threat. It also gives out advocacy grants to those who are in countries where these restrictions are increasing. And what we found is that civil society leaders who might not be comfortable working directly with the United States, because this is much more of a coalition involved in this program, they are willing to receive support, and it has had, through measuring the work that they're able to do after receiving these grants or this assistance, allowed them to continue to do their work even in very difficult situations.
So where is that becoming increasingly distinctly more challenging, and where is it not?
Unfortunately, I'd say it's becoming distinctly more challenging in many more places than it's not. Since 2012, 90 countries have enacted some sort of additional restriction or requirement on NGOs. Just in the last 6 months, in areas that we've looked at, Pakistan has put new regulations on international NGOs. Israel has created a new draft law which would require organizations receiving funding from foreign governments to identify themselves and wear a pin as a foreign agent whenever they're working with their Congress. It won't surprise you that countries like Egypt and China have put additional laws on. But we found that while there are some countries that things have gotten better, or some of our programs have been able to help modify laws, that in more places than not we're finding increasing restrictions.
I want to get, because I do want to talk a little bit in a minute about the Young African Leaders Initiative and such exchange programs as that.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to ask, I know that the whole sort of social media explosion that arose was immediately an opportunity for public diplomacy, and oh my gosh, we can reach young people and all kinds of people, and it overcomes the barriers that exist in terms of state interference. On the other hand, it's of course created great complications when it comes to recruiting people for ISIL, and it's become a real channel for extremism. And in the balance, when you look at it now, I'm just curious how you think this balance is tilting, and how you, the challenge of just trying to break through the huge distraction that all of this also presents.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on balance, I would say that it's still created more opportunities for people and for the United States government than challenges. As I look at how activists have used it, how people have held their governments to account, how ordinary people can tell what their governments are or aren't doing for them, can be connected to other like-minded people around the world. I think that those are incredible opportunities. I think the United States government has, given our difficulties in taking risk and innovating, I think we've actually done a pretty good job using technology to help people understand the United States and its policy and engage with our embassies around the world. But the last year, and particularly ISIL's rise, has certainly showed us how a savvy organization that has engaged young people who understand how to use social media has been able to weaponize the social media sphere and been able to use this for so much harm, both in the United States and overseas, with recruiting and radicalization. And so it's really made us take a hard look at we as a US government can't do it alone. We have to work very closely with the private sector, with Silicon Valley, with these American companies whose technology is being co-opted by terrorist groups to come together to try to build a more positive marketplace of ideas, to try to empower the people who can push back to do so, even when the United States government has challenges doing it ourselves.
Can we pause a little bit just on that? I mean, how do you do that? How do you try to push back against this weaponization? And what, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on some of the programs that you're assisting to do that sort of pushback.
Sure. So the State Department has recently launched the Global Engagement Center, which is an interagency body that works closely with the private sector and other non-governmental partners to try to do exactly that, to try to empower people who have ideas, positive visions, and who can push back against ISIL's vision of a caliphate and the incredible momentum that they show on social media. And it's everything from using public diplomacy grants to train up partners overseas in how to better use social media. It's creating messaging centers around the world, like the Hidayah Center, like Al-Sawab Center, and others. It's working with groups who we may not agree with all of their views, but if that's who people who are vulnerable to radicalization think are credible voices, it's making sure that they have support if they're willing to work with the United States government in order to help their voice rise above those that are hateful and radicalizing people. So one idea, one example of a program that we've been working on, which is interagency for the last couple of years, is called Peer-to-Peer Challenging Extremism. And it's brought together about 20 universities around the world, 10 in the United States, 10 globally, where teachers create a semester's worth of curriculum to talk to their students about radicalization and to give them tools so that they can go out and create their own platforms, many of which are online, many of which use other traditional communications platforms, to go out and push back against those narratives, create platforms to bring young people together. And then we hold a contest. We bring the top ideas into DC to the State Department. We've partnered with Facebook to help give some of those great ideas a lift so that they can cut above the noise. We have a contest to see which ones are the best and then look at how do we fund or find funding so that they can take their ideas to fruition. Because what we found is that young people around the world have a much better idea of what works than, frankly, government bureaucrats sitting in offices in the national security.
Have there been some fun ideas that have risen up and been really successful in that, through that?
Yeah, there was the 195 platform, which was launched out of last year's P2P program, which was essentially an online platform for youth to come together and aggregate content that shows the positive vision of how young people can be change makers and creates one place for people around the world to go to connect to each other, to build ideas, to start organizations in really unique ways. It has an app for people's phone. Another one was started by a group of young Muslim leaders overseas, which was an app for their phone in order to help give positive messages of how the Quran talks about peaceful coexistence in a way that the United States government could never do credibly, but these young people were able to find a way to bring lots of people on board with a different vision of Islam through their idea.
So when it comes to exchange programs, as far as I understand it anyway, and there are obviously a whole huge array of them, the Young African Leaders Initiative and things that have kind of grown out of that is something that you take quite seriously and are proud of, watching how it's grown. And so maybe you can just explain a bit why this has taken on the sort of stature it has and what's particularly meaningful about it.
Sure, thanks. So President Obama was very committed to engaging with Africa. He's now traveled to Africa more than any other president. And back in 2010, when he was traveling to South Africa, he was also looking at that demographic data, looking at the huge youth bulge in Africa, looking at many of the challenges that we face there, and asked the Global Engagement Office, working with the State Department and other agencies, to find a way to use our public diplomacy tools to engage young people. And so it began as an exchange program, and it has at its core an exchange program that last year brought 500 young leaders in civil society, governance, and entrepreneurship to the United States to study at top American universities, to connect young leaders from around Africa, to bring them together, so that when they go back home, they have other people working in the same area that they can continue to work with, as well as connections with young people in the United States who they studied with and got to know here. When we first put out the application to invite people to apply, it was an open competition. We got 40,000 applications, which told us just how much demand there was to engage with the United States around some of these topics.
To pick how many people?
500.
500, wow.
Yeah, it might have been even less for the very first cohort. So rather than just saying no thank you to the others, we built a digital network that brings together people through online tools, through Facebook, through online trainings, through emails, so that even if they can't come to the United States, which I think we would all agree is the best way to really help people understand our country, they can at least be engaged in connecting with other young leaders by using and leveraging these technological tools. But we also brought in USAID for them to create regional leadership training centers around Africa. There's now 4 up and running, where we bring additional young leaders who can't necessarily go on the exchange program but are doing incredible things in their country to come and attend. Usually it's an 8-week course where they can do that same type of networking. It's much more cost efficient to do it on the continent. We've brought in private sector partners, MasterCard Foundation, Microsoft, Deloitte, and others have all been involved. And so through this program, we've now been able to reach hundreds of thousands of young people. And it's one of these programs where I think the sum is greater than the parts. You know, it's only 500 people that in the grand scheme of like Africa's youth is a drop in the bucket. But when President Obama traveled to Kenya last summer, what he kept hearing about is that America is now known for the way it's empowering youth through YALI. He had other African heads of state talk to him about YALI and how they can be engaging their young people. And you've really had young people come here to the United States, see how their voices can be heard and how they can work together to create a different vision in their communities and start to demand a seat at the table back in their countries and with their governments. And so we've got lots of stories of YALI fellows doing incredible things and are just really proud and think that in another 10 or 20 years, hopefully these are the people like our IVLP participants who are going to be many of our leaders in business, in civil society, in government, and they'll have this unique understanding and engagement with the United States.
Now, I know your engagement doesn't entail engagement with Congress to convince them for more global engagement, or maybe it does. But I'm curious about just how convinced members of Congress are about the efficacy and the need to put more money into these kinds of programs.
I think Congress is very convinced about the utility of public diplomacy and exchange programs. I think they've had longer to see the fruits of programs like IVLP, like Fulbright, those that have been the bedrock of public diplomacy for so many years. I think when Congress goes out and they travel and they meet our YALI fellows and they meet our other alumni, then that's really what makes it tangible for them. And so I always, when I do have the opportunity, I encourage members of Congress or their staffs to not only meet with government, to not just have a schedule of meeting with the president and prime minister and economic minister and members of Congress, but to make sure that they're meeting with exchange program alumni and with other non-state actors, because they're going to see a very different side of the country, and they're going to see how these public diplomacy programs have really changed lives overseas.
I want to, in a second, go to questions, and I don't know, Daniel or whomever, whether there's have to activate mics or whatever to make that happen. I assume that happens, yeah. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the challenges of the making it happen side. We've been, at least in this political environment over the last couple of months, where certain people have suddenly said that we shouldn't let a whole group of other people into the country at all, and should we legislate something that would be along those lines? I mean, do you, even in the environment that you're in now, face obstacles in terms of bringing the people into the United States as part of some of these programs?
We haven't faced obstacles yet. I think the biggest damage that it's done is create a narrative around the world that just because a few very loud people think that way, that's how all of America may think. But we haven't so far had problems bringing people in. I think it's also cast a chill over creating new programs. We have to congressionally notify anytime we use money in different ways. And it's a difficult political environment right now, and so we have to be careful about how and when we may seek to engage the Muslim world and use funding to do so.
When you say it has cast a chill, what's the it in that?
It being, the statements that you hear out in the public discourse about having a ban on Muslims, or the need for even stronger vetting. I think we all agree we need very strong vetting, for example, with refugees, but to try to say that we're going to discriminate on the basis of religion to an entire group of people, I think personally is very harmful to our national security interests. And that actually now more than ever is when we need to make sure that people of all faiths, including Muslims around the world, are coming to the United States, are seeing firsthand what the United States is like, are seeing how people live in a pluralistic society with interfaith voices and coexistence largely in the United States.
So it's fair to say that the political campaign, the presidential campaign, has made public diplomacy a little more challenging? Is that what you're thinking?
It sounds like that's what you want me to say.
Oh, I'm just teasing. I could imagine that might have been the case. Let me just imagine.
Yeah, I mean, we're lucky that I haven't heard that, people have been turned around or anything terrible like that. But it makes you think twice. As you look at, okay, how do we solve this challenge? You have to have in the back of your mind, will there be people who will stop this from going forward? Right. And that's harmful.
Yeah. Questions of the NSC Senior Director of Global Engagement? I assume that there will be. Right here.
Thank you very much. I had the occasion to meet you at a
yes,
small meeting
right.
of the Fulbright Association called at a restaurant on Connecticut Avenue. Lauren Hershey is my name. I had a Fulbright scholarship to India in 1968 when it was 21 and I was 21. Question for you. Who can you credit with the idea of your office? And for clarification, were you the first holder of that office? And this second or third part of the question, do you have counterparts in the G7 or the G20? And if not, why not?
That's a great question. Thanks, and good to see you again. So I would credit the president and Ben Rhodes, his deputy national security advisor for communications, for coming up with our office. I work for Ben in his strategic communications directorate, which is made up of a press office, a speechwriting office, and the global engagement office. And we think of the Global Engagement Office as being the medium to longer term tools that are from public diplomacy that complement the day-to-day press work that our press colleagues do. Your second question was,
Are you
am
the
I the
first?
first?
Yeah.
No, I am probably the sixth at this point. Usually it's a one-year rotation, and I am lucky to be building on the foundation of what a lot of other incredible political appointees and other government detailees have done. Our office includes detailees from the State Department, USAID, and DoD. And so the idea is that whether we're looking at how do you counter Russian propaganda, or how do you build an interagency program to engage young Southeast Asian leaders, that we can work with these other agencies that share similar goals to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction. And your last question, I don't know my counterparts. They may be there, and it's a great idea, and I should go and figure out who they are. And particularly when you're looking at global challenges like climate change or the response to refugees, we should all be working together on those.
Or if we were to walk into the Office of Global Engagement, we're talking about like a dozen people or something
Oh
like
my
that?
gosh, I wish. So we have 5 people.
5 people, okay.
But the goal is not for us to go out and do things. The goal is
Right.
for us to coordinate the interagency and to put out the goals that we all want to work together. And so it's only because of the hard work of our colleagues at the State Department, at USAID, at DoD, at all of the other agencies, BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, that all of these programs that I feel so lucky to get to talk about actually happen. So we convene interagency policy committee meetings where we bring everyone together and figure out who's going to do what. And then when we hear about our colleagues having meetings on engaging in Cuba, or bringing ASEAN leaders for a summit in California next month, we help make sure that the right public diplomacy practitioners are plugged into those meetings so that they can give their perspectives, because we can't be everywhere.
Yes, right back there.
Possibly a very good follow-on, more on structure. About 2 weeks ago, the State Department announced publicly a new communication structure, I think called Global Engagement Center. And it described a network of affiliations with the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, the White House. Could you elaborate more on how that new structure is going to work?
Sure. So the new Global Engagement Center is the evolution of a center that was started back in 2010 called the CSCC. And I should know what that stands for, but like a good government bureaucrat, I'm used to calling it the CSCC. It was the Strategic Communications Counterterrorism Center. And, it was very focused on direct U.S. government messaging as a response to the rise of terrorist groups. And it includes interagency detailees from the Department of Defense, from all of the departments that you mentioned. And what we saw is that as the threat in terrorism and how they were using communications platforms changed, we needed to change the way that we were responding. And so the US government going into chat rooms and tweeting wasn't the best way to continue to counter that threat. And so we've launched the Global Engagement Center to be less about direct US government messaging and more about empowering partners, local credible voices, and how do we use public diplomacy tools and engagement with the private sector in order to better do that.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for being here. I was really excited to hear you talk about the peer-to-peer project as someone who's heard about it, and also I think that the projects that have come out of it are great.
Cool.
And so you mentioned that you are interested in more in engaging non-state actors and civil society. And I guess the question is for organizations here who are in their communities, how can they encourage their communities to get involved in things like peer-to-peer? And as sort of a second follow-up question, to what extent is your office sort of guiding these non-state actors that you're empowering towards what kind of things, how to say things efficiently and how to get the message out?
Great. So on the first question, even though our office looks very much at the international audience, and so we don't engage as much with the domestic groups that are working in this area as much as the State Department does. I hope that we're getting out to people and working with the State Department to get out to people when we have new opportunities to become involved. Another opportunity that's recently come about that local groups could apply for and would be great to get involved with is the Stevens Initiative. And this is named after Ambassador Chris Stevens, who passed away in Libya, and kind of builds on his work with the Peace Corps in the Middle East and his fundamental philosophy of engagement throughout all his time in foreign policy, and is a multi-million-dollar tech. It uses exchange, but looks at how can we use technological tools to bring people together with a physical component, but is now having multiple grant applications, requests for proposals. And so that could be a great opportunity for local groups that are kind of plugged into many of the coalitions that you all are engaged in to be applying to be part of some of these newer initiatives. But I think, hopefully we're working well with Global Ties and all the other partners that bring all of you together to be passing along these types of new opportunities. And if we're not, then we should do a better job doing that so that we can really use the incredible expertise that you all have built out through IVLP and the other programs that you do. Can you remind me your second question again? Right. So we're generally building our programs around and trying to empower people in ways that support our national security goals. So just to give an example, the complementary program to YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative, is the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. And that one was built around a different set of foreign policy goals. It's to create an ASEAN identity, to bring people together around environmental work, civil society, and entrepreneurship, and to help build people-to-people ties throughout ASEAN and with the United States as part of the Obama administration's rebalance. And so I think rather than wanting our participants to feel like we're telling them what to do in those areas, what we do is we use the educational opportunities and our interactions to help shape the type of topics that they learn about, such that we're identifying people who are already working in ways that we think complement our national security goals, and then try to give them tools and ideas to help support them along the way.
Right back there, there's, sorry,
Hi.
there you are, sorry.
Good afternoon. My name is Wilka, and I am an exchange student
Great.
from Brazil. I've been in 3 different programs, and when you mentioned that you've been to Latin America, I'm very curious, what kind of exchange programs are you working on?
Thanks for that question, and it's great to have you here. So one of the big exchange program and public diplomacy programs that the Obama administration has built in Latin America is called the 100,000 Strong in the Americas Initiative. And this was very much looking at our foreign policy goals of building more interconnectivity between students in Latin America and the United States to help prepare them for a globalized workforce, identifying the huge economic opportunities that are coming through peace and stability in Latin America, and wanting to have more American students studying in and understanding Latin America, and more Latin American students with ties to an educational experience in the United States. And so back in 2010, we set this goal of having 100,000 Latin American students studying in the United States, 100,000 American students studying overseas. And rather than give individual scholarships, we've worked with the private sector to offer grant opportunities through competitions to universities to build programs between universities in order to increase the number of students and the infrastructure for students to go back and forth. So we're getting really close on the amount of Latin American students who have come to the United States, thanks largely in part to Brazil. The Brazilian government has been an amazing partner on 100,000 Strong and has significantly increased their students, especially studying in science and technology. We have a ways to go with American students studying overseas. So hopefully you all, through your networks of students that you know in where you all are working, can be encouraging even more students to go study abroad, and particularly in their backyard in Latin America. So that's just one example of a big public diplomacy initiative that we've built out in Latin America.
Maybe we'll take a couple more. I think we have one over here.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Rita Rowan. I'm with George Mason University. We have an Office of Global Strategy, and I'm a Fulbright recipient. A quick follow-up to the peer-to-peer program. When you mentioned the 10 universities that you seek, can those be domestic universities as well? And then could you briefly highlight your career path and what kind of advice you would have to college students if they wanted a career that's somewhat like your own?
Sure. Yeah, we are always looking for new universities to participate and are looking to expand the program. So it's Ed Ventures that runs it, but I'd be happy to exchange information with anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about it and to become involved. On your question about my career path, so I feel very lucky to have done an internship with the State Department when I was in college. And I think that that really gave me a clear-eyed view of what a career in the State Department would be like. I was an intern at our embassy in Slovenia, and then I came back in my senior year of college. I went to school here locally. I worked as a reader for a blind employee because I had a security clearance and they needed someone with a security clearance to be his eyes. And so I got to learn about the State Department through working with him my senior year, which prepared me to take the Foreign Service exam. And so one of my pieces of advice to especially college students who are interested in international affairs is go overseas, get some experience. I dropped out of school to take the internship, which before like Mark Zuckerberg and all sorts of other people did it was not seen as cool, and my parents were not excited about. But I'm so glad I did because I got to learn about it and figure out that this really was the career for me. And then when I joined, I think you have to kind of be prepared to do anything. You're a generalist in the State Department. And so I, like every other Foreign Service officer, spent a year stamping visas and interviewing 150, in my case, Indians a day who wanted to come to the United States. Then I got to go do political reporting in our embassy in India during a really exciting time for US-India relationship. So my other piece of advice to people is that you need to be willing to kind of do your time in order to, a lot of people join the State Department thinking they're immediately going to go give policy advice to the president. And I can vouch that you can get there, but you've got to be willing to be the person who handles luggage when the congressional members come into town. You've got to kind of be willing to learn the ropes by doing all sorts of other jobs. And then the other kind of theme throughout my career is that while my passion is in public diplomacy, while I joined because I wanted to engage with foreign publics and make a difference in the way that they see and work with the United States, I've always kept kind of one foot in the policy stream and the other foot in the public diplomacy stream. And so have done public diplomacy work around the world, but when I've come back to the State Department, tried to make sure I understand the policy-making process at the State Department. And so my third piece of advice would be to make sure, if you want a career in this area, that you understand both realms. I love cultural and educational programs. I think that mutual understanding is really important, but I also think that we have to be stewards of taxpayer dollars and make sure that the programs that we create are very tangibly supporting our foreign policy goals. And so you really have to be able to understand both of those worlds, I think, to be successful in the public diplomacy field.
We're going to wrap it up there. I think that was absolutely great. I'm going to begin the applause because you were spectacular.
Oh, thank you.